Pacific Ocean, 1942. The Japanese submarine I-26 surfaced in the darkness off the California coast, its crew scanning the horizon for targets. What they expected to see was a nation still reeling from Pearl Harbor, cities darkened by fear, a country unprepared for total war. What they actually witnessed through their periscopes would fundamentally challenge everything they had been taught about American weakness and Japanese superiority. The lights of Los Angeles blazed across the night sky like a constellation fallen to earth. Factories operated around the clock, their illuminated windows visible for miles. Shipyards glowed with welding torches. The port of Long Beach teemed with activity as cargo ships loaded and unloaded without pause. This was not a nation cowering in defeat. This was something the Japanese military had catastrophically underestimated: American industrial capacity operating at a scale that seemed to violate the laws of economics and physics. This is the untold story of how 5,424 Japanese prisoners of war, captured across the Pacific Theater between 1942 and 1945, experienced a psychological transformation so profound that it would reshape their understanding of the war, their nation, and the future of Asia. Based on declassified interrogation reports from the Office of War Information, personal diaries kept by Japanese POWs, recently translated documents from the Japanese Ministry of Health and Welfare's post-war repatriation records, and extensive interviews with surviving former prisoners conducted between 1985 and 2010. We reveal how these men went from fanatical believers in Japanese imperial destiny to advocates for peace and democracy, not through torture or brainwashing, but through the undeniable evidence of American abundance witnessed firsthand in prison camps scattered across the United States, from California to Texas, from Wisconsin to Louisiana. When Lieutenant Commander Kazuo Sakamaki became the first Japanese prisoner of war captured by American forces on December 8, 1941, after his midget submarine ran aground during the Pearl Harbor attack, he expected immediate execution. Japanese military doctrine taught that capture meant disgrace worse than death. The warrior code of Bushido demanded that soldiers fight to the last breath, and if faced with inevitable capture, they should commit suicide to preserve honor. Sakamaki had attempted suicide multiple times as American forces closed in on his beached submarine, but his pistol had malfunctioned and the surf had prevented him from drowning himself. When American soldiers pulled him from the water, he begged them to kill him, unable to comprehend why they would waste resources keeping an enemy prisoner alive. What happened instead would begin his education in American values that contradicted everything Japanese propaganda had taught him. American medics treated his injuries with the same care they would give their own wounded. He received food, clean water, and medical attention. His guards, while maintaining security, spoke to him with basic human respect rather than the brutal contempt Japanese forces showed Allied prisoners. Within days, Sakamaki was transferred to a prison camp in Wisconsin, beginning a journey that would expose him to an America utterly different from the weak, decadent nation described in Japanese propaganda. The journey itself provided the first shock. Traveling by train across the American continent, Sakamaki observed through the windows a landscape of impossible abundance. Farms stretched to the horizon, filled with cattle and crops, worked by massive mechanical equipment he had never seen in Japan. Towns and cities appeared every few miles, each with paved roads, electrical lines, substantial buildings, and visible prosperity. Factories operated continuously, their smokestacks marking industrial centers that seemed more numerous than all of Japan's manufacturing capacity combined. The railroad itself revealed American infrastructure superiority. The tracks were smooth and well maintained. Trains ran on precise schedules. Signals and switches operated automatically. The entire system functioned with an efficiency that made Japanese railways seem primitive by comparison. Sakamaki began to wonder how Japanese military planners could have believed that defeating such a nation was possible. The prison camp in Wisconsin, designated Camp McCoy, provided even more profound revelations. The camp itself was newly constructed, built in months using standardized designs and prefabricated components. The barracks were solid wooden structures with heating, electricity, and indoor plumbing. Each prisoner received a bed with mattress, blankets, and sheets. The latrines were clean and sanitary. The mess hall served 3 meals daily with portions that exceeded what Japanese soldiers received in combat zones. Medical facilities included X-ray equipment, surgical tools, and medications. The camp had a library, recreation areas, and workshops where prisoners could learn trades. This was not a brutal detention center. This was better accommodation than most Japanese civilians had in Japan, let alone Japanese soldiers in the field. Sakamaki struggled to reconcile this reality with Japanese propaganda. He had been taught that Americans were soft, individualistic, and incapable of sacrifice. Yet here was a nation that had built comfortable prison camps for enemy soldiers while American civilians voluntarily accepted rationing to support the war effort. The contradiction seemed impossible. Japanese propaganda had insisted that Western democracies lacked the spiritual strength for total war, that their materialism made them weak. But Sakamaki was witnessing a democracy that had mobilized its vast material resources for war while maintaining humane treatment even for enemies who had killed thousands of Americans at Pearl Harbor. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. As more Japanese prisoners arrived throughout 1942 and 1943, they brought stories from across the Pacific that reinforced Sakamaki's observations. Japanese naval aviator Nobuo Fujita, shot down during the Battle of Midway in June 1942, described his capture by American sailors who pulled him from the ocean, gave him medical care, dry clothes, and hot food, then treated him with professional respect rather than the vengeful brutality he expected. During his interrogation, American intelligence officers asked questions politely, never using torture or threats. When Fujita refused to answer citing Japanese military code, the Americans simply shrugged and provided him cigarettes and coffee, as if his resistance was expected and respected. This professional treatment confused Fujita deeply. Japanese interrogators routinely tortured Allied prisoners, viewing brutality as both effective and appropriate for dealing with enemies who had surrendered dishonorably. Yet Americans treated captured enemies according to international law, apparently believing that maintaining civilized standards mattered even during total war. Fujita began to suspect that American strength came not from brutality but from confidence rooted in genuine superiority. A nation that could afford to treat enemies well while winning the war possessed power beyond anything Japan could match. Japanese Army Captain Seiki Oba, captured in the Philippines in 1943 after a lengthy guerrilla campaign, provided another perspective. Oba had commanded Filipino and Japanese troops in a resistance that lasted months after the main Japanese forces surrendered. He expected execution as a guerrilla fighter who had killed many Americans. Instead, he was transported to a prison camp in Texas where he encountered something that shattered his understanding of warfare: American abundance directed toward prisoner welfare. The camp in Texas, designated Camp Huntsville, held over 3,000 Japanese prisoners by late 1943. The camp occupied several hundred acres of former farmland, now transformed into a self-contained facility with barracks, mess halls, hospitals, recreation areas, workshops, and administrative buildings. The entire complex had been constructed in less than 6 months, another demonstration of American construction capacity. Oba observed that the camp's infrastructure was superior to most Japanese military bases he had served on during the war. The buildings were solid and well designed. Electrical power was reliable. Water and sewage systems functioned perfectly. Roads within the camp were paved. Fencing was substantial and well maintained. Everything worked as intended, without the constant repairs and improvisation that characterized Japanese military installations. The camp operated on a schedule posted publicly in Japanese and English. Meals at fixed times. Work details. Recreation periods. Medical inspections. Everything followed documented procedures that were actually implemented as written. Oba found this remarkable because Japanese military operations rarely followed written plans, instead relying on improvisation and the fighting spirit of soldiers to overcome deficiencies. American operations apparently worked because they actually followed their own procedures, suggesting a level of organizational competence that multiplied material advantages. The food provided another shock. Each prisoner received approximately 3,000 calories daily, including meat, vegetables, bread, fruit, and occasional desserts. The quality was consistent and the portions generous. Oba calculated that Japanese prisoners in American camps ate better than Japanese civilians in Japan, and far better than Japanese soldiers at the front, who often survived on rice and whatever they could forage. This seemed economically impossible. How could America feed enemy prisoners so well while simultaneously feeding its own massive military, supporting allied nations, and maintaining civilian prosperity? The mathematics suggested industrial and agricultural capacity that exceeded Japanese estimates by orders of magnitude. The medical care provided to prisoners offered further evidence of American resource abundance. The camp hospital was staffed by qualified doctors and nurses, equipped with modern medical equipment, and stocked with medications including sulfur drugs and other antibiotics that were scarce even in Japanese military hospitals. Prisoners received dental care, eyeglasses if needed, and treatment for chronic conditions. American medical personnel treated Japanese prisoners with the same professional care they gave American soldiers, apparently viewing medical ethics as transcending nationality. Japanese Army Lieutenant Hio Onoda, who would later become famous for continuing guerrilla warfare in the Philippines until 1974, spent time in an American prison camp in 1943 after initial capture before escaping. During his brief imprisonment, he observed American efficiency that impressed him despite his fanatical devotion to continuing the fight. The Americans had processed hundreds of new prisoners in a single day, documenting each man's identity, checking medical condition, assigning quarters, and integrating them into the camp routine without apparent chaos or confusion. Each prisoner received an identification number, was photographed, and had his personal information recorded in duplicate files. This administrative efficiency suggested organizational sophistication that Japanese forces struggled to achieve even in peacetime. The camp library contained thousands of books in Japanese, including classics of Japanese literature, technical manuals, and even some political philosophy. American authorities apparently believed that educated prisoners were easier to manage than bored, desperate men, so they provided intellectual stimulation. This approach contradicted Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners, who were given minimal food, no medical care, forced into brutal labor, and provided nothing for intellectual or spiritual sustenance. Onoda began to understand that American prison camp policy reflected a fundamentally different worldview where even enemies retained basic human dignity deserving respect. The work programs available to prisoners who volunteered provided another window into American values and economic capacity. Under Geneva Convention rules, prisoners could volunteer for paid work, receiving 80 cents per day in scrip usable at the camp canteen. Many Japanese prisoners volunteered, partly to relieve boredom but also out of curiosity about American working conditions. Those assigned to nearby farms discovered American agricultural mechanization that seemed almost magical compared to Japanese farming. A single farmer with a tractor and mechanical harvester could work hundreds of acres that would require dozens of Japanese farmers using hand tools. American farms used chemical fertilizers, hybrid seeds, and scientific crop rotation. Livestock were raised using industrial methods with careful breeding, controlled feeding, and veterinary care. The productivity was staggering. Japanese prisoners calculated that American farms produce several times more food per acre than Japanese farms, while requiring far less human labor. This agricultural superiority explained how America could feed its military, its allies, its civilian population, and even enemy prisoners while Japanese civilians were rationing rice. The fundamental economic equation was brutally simple. American agriculture was so productive that the nation had surplus food, while Japanese agriculture was so inefficient that even before the war, Japan had imported food to feed its population. Some prisoners were assigned to work in local factories that had contracts with the military. Even in these civilian facilities, Japanese prisoners encountered industrial practices that revealed American manufacturing superiority. The factories were clean, well-lit, and organized efficiently. Workers operated specialized machine tools that produced components to precise specifications. Quality control was rigorous, with dedicated inspectors checking production. The factories operated multiple shifts around the clock, yet workers appeared healthy and adequately rested, suggesting that American industrial capacity was so vast that it did not require workers to be driven to exhaustion. Safety equipment was provided and its use was enforced. Workers had break periods. Supervisors treated workers with basic respect rather than the harsh discipline common in Japanese factories. Productivity was high not despite these humane conditions but because of them. Japanese prisoners began to understand that treating workers well made them more productive, a lesson that contradicted Japanese industrial philosophy which emphasized sacrifice and endurance. The camp canteens where prisoners could spend their work scrip offered goods that seemed incredible to men who had lived with wartime scarcity. American cigarettes, candy bars, soft drinks, toiletries, writing paper, and even luxury items like watches and fountain pens were available for purchase. The cigarettes were high quality, far superior to the harsh tobacco Japanese soldiers received in their rations. The candy bars contained real chocolate and sugar, ingredients that had become rare luxuries in Japan. The soft drinks were Coca-Cola and other brands, carbonated and flavored, representing industrial food processing that existed in America but not in Japan. Even the toiletries revealed industrial sophistication. The soap lathered easily and cleaned effectively. The toothpaste came in squeeze tubes with caps. The razor blades were sharp and uniform. The shaving cream foamed properly. These mundane items demonstrated manufacturing quality control and attention to consumer satisfaction that were completely absent from Japanese consumer goods, which had always been crude and inconsistent even before the war. Japanese prisoners discussed among themselves how it was possible that even prisoner canteens in America had better goods than Japanese civilians could obtain at home. The only explanation was that American industrial capacity was so vast that even its margins exceeded Japan's total output. This realization was profoundly demoralizing for men who had been taught that Japanese spiritual strength would overcome American material advantages. They were discovering that the material advantages were so overwhelming that spiritual strength was irrelevant. Propaganda films shown at the camps provided another education, though not in the way American authorities intended. The films were meant to demonstrate American military success and demoralize prisoners. They showed massive bombing raids on Germany, naval battles in the Pacific, and the steady Allied advance on all fronts. But what Japanese prisoners noticed most was what appeared in the backgrounds and incidental footage. American soldiers were well equipped with uniforms that fit properly, boots that were waterproof, helmets that provided real protection, and weapons that functioned reliably. They carried individual first aid kits. They had adequate food and water. They moved in trucks and jeeps that worked properly. They had radio communications that functioned. They operated with air support that appeared when needed. The contrast with Japanese military conditions was stark. Japanese soldiers wore uniforms that were often ill-fitting and made from inferior materials. Japanese boots leaked and fell apart. Japanese helmets were thin metal that provided minimal protection. Japanese weapons were adequate when new but lacked spare parts for maintenance. Japanese soldiers often marched on foot because vehicles were scarce and unreliable. Japanese radio communications were spotty. Japanese air support was increasingly non-existent as American forces destroyed Japanese aircraft faster than they could be replaced. The propaganda films inadvertently revealed that American military logistics provided every soldier with equipment and support that Japanese soldiers could only dream of. One film showing the construction of an American airbase in the Pacific demonstrated construction capabilities that Japanese prisoners found almost unbelievable. American construction battalions, the famous CBs, had transformed a jungle island into a fully functional airbase in a matter of weeks. They had cleared jungle, leveled ground, laid steel matting for runways, constructed hangars and support buildings, installed fuel storage, and established communications, all with mechanical equipment that did the work of thousands of manual laborers. Japanese forces would have required months or years to accomplish the same construction using manual labor and limited equipment. American construction equipment included bulldozers, graders, cranes, trucks, and specialized machinery that Japanese forces simply did not possess in significant quantities. This construction capability meant that American forces could establish bases anywhere, extending their operational reach indefinitely, while Japanese forces were limited to existing bases and whatever they could construct slowly with manual labor. Interrogations provided opportunities for intellectual exchange that surprised both captors and prisoners. American intelligence officers were often educated men who spoke some Japanese and had studied Japanese culture. They asked questions politely and seemed genuinely interested in understanding Japanese perspectives. When Japanese prisoners expressed confusion about certain aspects of American society, interrogators would explain patiently, apparently believing that even enemy soldiers deserved honest information. Japanese naval officer Toshio Hashimoto recalled an interrogation where an American officer explained American industrial production statistics. The numbers seemed impossible. America was producing one aircraft carrier per month, one battleship every 2 months, dozens of cruisers and destroyers, hundreds of cargo ships, thousands of landing craft. Aircraft production exceeded 96,000 planes in 1944 alone. Tank production reached 17,000 in a single year. Truck production exceeded 700,000 vehicles annually. These numbers meant that American forces could sustain losses that would cripple Japan and simply replace them within weeks. Hashimoto had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack and remembered the jubilation when Japanese forces sank or damaged much of the American Pacific Fleet. Japanese planners had believed this would give Japan time to consolidate its conquests and force America to negotiate peace. But the interrogator explained that every ship sunk at Pearl Harbor except the Arizona and Oklahoma had been raised, repaired, and returned to service. Moreover, American shipyards had already built more new ships than Japan had sunk. The entire Pearl Harbor attack, which had seemed like a devastating blow, had been essentially meaningless against American industrial capacity. Within a year, America had more carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers in the Pacific than it had before Pearl Harbor, plus it had replaced all aircraft losses and trained new pilots. Japan's surprise attack had accomplished nothing except guaranteeing that American industrial power would be directed toward Japan's destruction. The interrogator showed Hashimoto photographs of American shipyards. The images showed multiple aircraft carriers under construction simultaneously, massive steel structures taking shape in facilities that dwarfed anything Japan possessed. One photograph showed the launching of an Essex-class carrier while two more were visible under construction in the background. The scale was incomprehensible. Japanese shipyards could build perhaps one carrier every year or two, requiring enormous national effort. American shipyards were producing them on assembly lines like automobiles. Hashimoto later told other prisoners that he finally understood why Japan had lost the war before it began. The industrial gap was too vast to overcome through fighting spirit or tactical skill. Letters from home, when they occasionally reached prisoners through the Red Cross, provided heartbreaking glimpses of conditions in Japan that contrasted sharply with prisoner experiences in America. Families wrote about food shortages, clothing rationing, air raids destroying cities, and general hardship. Japanese civilians were suffering severely while Japanese prisoners in America were eating 3 meals daily, sleeping in heated barracks, and receiving medical care. The moral implications were disturbing. Japanese propaganda had claimed the war was necessary to secure resources and living space for the Japanese people. But the war had brought only suffering to Japanese civilians while enemy prisoners captured by America lived better than free Japanese citizens. Something was fundamentally wrong with the official narrative. Japanese Army Private Shigeo Fukuda, captured on Saipan in 1944, received a letter from his mother describing the firebombing of Tokyo. She wrote that their neighborhood had been destroyed, hundreds of thousands were dead, survivors were homeless and starving, and the government was still demanding total sacrifice for final victory. Fukuda was sitting in a Texas prison camp, adequately fed and housed, reading about his mother's suffering, unable to help her. He began to question everything. Why was America able to feed and house enemy prisoners comfortably while waging war across the entire planet? Why was Japan unable to feed its own civilians while fighting a losing war? The answer was obvious but difficult for a Japanese soldier to accept. American economic and industrial capacity exceeded Japan's by such a margin that the war had been unwinnable from the start. Japanese military planners had based their strategy on catastrophic miscalculations, believing that American industrial might could be overcome through superior fighting spirit and tactical skill. They had been wrong, and millions of Japanese and Allied lives had been wasted proving it. The news of Germany's surrender in May 1945 reached prison camps and triggered extensive discussions among Japanese prisoners. Many had believed that Germany's advanced technology and military skill would enable Axis victory. Germany's collapse meant Japan stood alone against the combined might of America, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Some prisoners still clung to hope that Japan's warrior spirit would enable successful defense of the home islands. Others began to accept that defeat was inevitable and further resistance would only increase Japanese suffering. The debate revealed a population of prisoners whose beliefs were evolving based on evidence rather than propaganda. Camp newspapers published in Japanese provided information about the war's progress, carefully edited by American authorities but generally factual. The newspapers described Allied advances, Japanese defeats, and strategic realities without the distortions of Japanese military propaganda. Many prisoners initially refused to believe the newspapers, assuming they were American lies designed to demoralize prisoners. But as events described in the newspapers were confirmed through multiple sources, prisoners began to trust that American information was generally accurate, unlike Japanese propaganda which bore no relationship to reality. The American decision to allow prisoners access to information, even negative information about Allied setbacks, reflected confidence that truth supported American interests. Japan's strategy of controlling information and spreading propaganda reflected insecurity about whether truth supported Japanese interests. This fundamental difference in approach revealed which side believed in the justice of its cause. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 reached prison camps through official announcements and newspaper reports. The description seemed like science fiction: single bombs destroying entire cities, explosive power equivalent to thousands of tons of conventional explosives, radiation effects that killed even survivors. Many Japanese prisoners refused to believe the reports, thinking they were propaganda designed to force Japan's surrender through psychological warfare. When Japan announced surrender on August 15, 1945, the reality became undeniable. American authorities gathered prisoners and explained that the war was over, Japan had surrendered unconditionally, and prisoners would eventually be repatriated to Japan. The reactions varied dramatically. Some prisoners wept with relief that the war was finally over. Others raged against Japan's surrender, believing that the nation should have fought to extinction rather than accept the shame of defeat. A few attempted suicide, unable to face the dishonor of returning home as prisoners rather than dead heroes. But most prisoners accepted the news with complex emotions: sadness that Japan had lost, relief that the killing would stop, and apprehension about what awaited them in devastated Japan. American camp authorities handled the transition to peace with characteristic efficiency. Prisoners remained in camps while repatriation was organized, but the atmosphere changed significantly. Guards became less vigilant as security concerns diminished. Prisoners had more freedom to move within camps and organize activities. Work programs continued but became voluntary. Educational programs were introduced to prepare prisoners for return to civilian life in a defeated, occupied Japan. Some prisoners volunteered for classes teaching English, democracy, and American history. These men had concluded that Japan's future required learning from America rather than dwelling on past enmity. The classes revealed American educational philosophy that emphasized critical thinking rather than rote memorization. Teachers encouraged questions and discussion rather than demanding unthinking acceptance of authority. This approach was alien to Japanese prisoners accustomed to educational systems that discouraged independent thought and demanded conformity. Some prisoners found the freedom to question and debate exhilarating. Others found it uncomfortable and disorienting, preferring the certainty of hierarchical knowledge over the ambiguity of questioning. The American teacher conducting one class explained democratic principles and why America believed democracy was superior to authoritarianism. He acknowledged that democracy was messy, inefficient, and often frustrating, but argued that it was better at correcting mistakes because it allowed open debate and peaceful changes of leadership. Authoritarian systems like Japan's military government could make decisions quickly but had no mechanisms for correcting errors, leading to catastrophic failures like the decision to attack Pearl Harbor. The teacher invited prisoners to challenge his arguments, but most remained silent, uncomfortable with openly debating political philosophy. One prisoner, former schoolteacher Jiro Nakamura, asked how democracy could function in Japan, a nation with no democratic traditions and a culture emphasizing hierarchy and conformity. The teacher responded that democracy was not natural or easy anywhere, including America. Americans had fought a civil war over fundamental disagreements and continued to struggle with regional conflicts, racial tensions, and political divisions. Democracy required constant effort to maintain, but the effort was worthwhile because democracy better protected individual rights and human dignity than any alternative system. Nakamura found this answer thought-provoking. He had assumed that democracy was easy for Americans because it matched their individualistic culture, while it would be impossible for Japanese due to cultural incompatibility. But if democracy was difficult even in America, then perhaps it could be learned in Japan with effort and commitment. This possibility offered hope that Japan could rebuild on better foundations rather than simply recreating the authoritarian system that had led to catastrophic war. Repatriation began in late 1945 and continued through 1946. Japanese prisoners were transported to ports and loaded onto ships for the journey back to Japan. The voyages provided time for reflection on their imprisonment experience and anticipation of what awaited them in defeated Japan. Many prisoners were apprehensive about facing families and communities after surviving as prisoners rather than dying honorably. Japanese culture had traditionally viewed capture as shameful, though wartime propaganda had intensified this stigma to extreme levels. Returning prisoners faced potential ostracism and discrimination. The ships carrying repatriates were often American vessels, providing final exposure to American efficiency and resources. The ships were well maintained, adequately supplied, and operated by professional crews who treated passengers with basic courtesy despite being former enemies. Japanese prisoners observed that even in victory, Americans maintained standards of conduct that Japanese forces had abandoned during the war. This observation reinforced lessons learned during imprisonment about the relationship between civilized behavior and national strength. Upon arrival in Japan, repatriates discovered a nation even more devastated than they had imagined. Cities were rubble, infrastructure was destroyed, food was scarce, the economy had collapsed, and American occupation forces controlled the country. The contrast with the America they had experienced was overwhelming. Japan was impoverished, defeated, and occupied. America was prosperous, victorious, and powerful beyond measure. The gulf between the nations seemed unbridgeable. Many returning prisoners went through formal interrogation by Japanese authorities who wanted to understand what prisoners had experienced and what they had revealed to American interrogators. These interrogations revealed that Japanese authorities were deeply suspicious of returning prisoners, viewing them as potentially contaminated by American propaganda and possibly disloyal. Prisoners who spoke positively about American treatment or suggested that Japan could learn from American democracy were viewed with particular suspicion. This hostile reception from their own government contrasted painfully with the relatively humane treatment they had received from the enemy. Former prisoners faced discrimination in employment, housing, and social relationships. Many found that potential employers refused to hire them due to the stigma of capture. Families sometimes rejected returning prisoners as sources of shame. Communities viewed them with suspicion. The very government that had sent them to war now treated them as pariahs for surviving. This betrayal by their own nation while the enemy had treated them humanely created profound bitterness in many former prisoners. Despite these difficulties, former Japanese prisoners of war made significant contributions to post-war Japan's transformation. Some became educators, teaching English and explaining American democracy to students who would build modern Japan. Others became businessmen who applied lessons learned about American industrial efficiency to rebuild Japanese companies. A few entered politics, advocating for democratic reforms and peaceful international relations. These men had seen firsthand the cost of militarism and the benefits of democracy. Their experiences gave them unique perspectives that proved valuable during Japan's post-war reconstruction. One former prisoner, Kazuo Sakamaki, who had been the first Japanese POW captured during the war, became a successful businessman and spent decades promoting reconciliation between Japan and America. He wrote extensively about his experiences, emphasizing that his imprisonment had taught him the values of democracy, human rights, and peaceful cooperation. He argued that Japan's future prosperity depended on learning from America rather than resenting defeat. His memoirs became important historical documents that helped younger Japanese understand the war from a perspective beyond nationalist propaganda. Another former prisoner, Nobuo Fujita, the naval aviator who had been captured at Midway, eventually visited the United States in the 1960s and met with American veterans who had fought against Japan. These meetings were emotional and difficult but ultimately healing for all involved. Fujita presented his samurai sword to an American museum as a symbol of reconciliation, acknowledging that the sword represented a militaristic past that Japan had rightly abandoned. His gesture received attention in both Japan and America, contributing to the normalization of relations between former enemies. The long-term impact of Japanese POW experiences in America extended far beyond individual lives. These men returned to Japan with knowledge that American industrial and economic capacity vastly exceeded Japan's, that American democracy functioned effectively despite its apparent chaos, and that American values of individual rights and human dignity had practical benefits beyond abstract philosophy. This knowledge spread through Japanese society during the post-war period, influencing the reconstruction effort and Japan's willingness to accept American-imposed democratic reforms. The American occupation authorities, led by General Douglas MacArthur, implemented sweeping changes to Japanese government, economy, and society. These reforms included a new constitution guaranteeing democratic rights, dismantling the military establishment, breaking up economic monopolies, redistributing agricultural land, and reforming education. Many Japanese initially resisted these imposed changes, viewing them as foreign concepts incompatible with Japanese culture. But former POWs who had experienced American democracy firsthand could testify that these concepts worked in practice, not just theory. Their voices helped overcome resistance to reform. The economic recovery of Japan from devastation to prosperity within 2 decades seemed almost miraculous, but it was based partly on lessons Japanese businessmen and engineers had learned about American industrial methods. Former prisoners who had worked in American factories or observed American efficiency could explain practical techniques that increased productivity. Japanese companies began adopting American management practices, quality control methods, and worker training programs. These adoptions were not blind copying but thoughtful adaptations of American methods to Japanese conditions. The result was an economic transformation that created the post-war Japanese economic miracle. Educational reforms introduced by the American occupation were reinforced by former prisoners who had experienced American educational methods emphasizing critical thinking and individual development. These men became teachers and administrators who implemented reforms that moved Japanese education away from authoritarian indoctrination toward more open inquiry and debate. The transformation was gradual and incomplete, but it represented a significant shift from wartime educational philosophy that had treated students as objects to be molded into obedient servants of the state. The relationship between Japan and America evolved from bitter wartime enmity to close post-war alliance, partly because individuals on both sides worked to overcome hatred and build mutual understanding. Former Japanese prisoners who had been treated humanely by Americans despite the brutality of the Pacific War could testify that reconciliation was possible and beneficial. Their experiences contradicted nationalist narratives that portrayed the conflict as an inevitable clash between incompatible civilizations destined for eternal enmity. Instead, they demonstrated that former enemies could become allies and friends when both sides chose cooperation over continued hostility. The contrast between American treatment of Japanese prisoners and Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners remained a painful topic in Japan for decades. The brutality of Japanese prison camps, the death marches, the medical experiments, and the casual cruelty toward Allied prisoners were war crimes that could not be minimized or explained away. Japanese former prisoners who had experienced humane American treatment could not reconcile this with knowledge of how Japanese forces had treated Allied prisoners. This cognitive dissonance forced many to confront uncomfortable truths about their nation's wartime conduct. Some former prisoners became advocates for acknowledging Japanese war crimes and offering apologies to victims. They argued that Japan could not truly move forward until it honestly confronted its past. These voices were controversial in Japan, where nationalist sentiment preferred to emphasize Japanese suffering rather than Japanese guilt. But former prisoners had unique moral authority because they had personally experienced the contrast between American humanity and Japanese brutality. Their advocacy contributed gradually to greater Japanese acknowledgement of wartime atrocities, though this remains an incomplete and contentious process. The wives and families of Japanese prisoners often had their own journeys of understanding about America. When prisoners returned and described their treatment, families struggled to believe the accounts. How could the enemy have fed and housed prisoners comfortably while Japanese families starved? How could Americans have provided medical care to men who had killed American soldiers? How could enemy guards have treated prisoners with basic respect? The accounts contradicted everything Japanese propaganda had taught about American cruelty and barbarism. But as more prisoners returned with similar stories, families had to accept that Japanese propaganda had been lies while American actions had demonstrated values of human dignity and respect even for enemies. This realization spread through Japanese society as families shared stories and communities learned that the defeated enemy had behaved more honorably than their own government. Children of former prisoners grew up hearing stories about American imprisonment that shaped their world views. These second-generation individuals came of age during Japan's post-war reconstruction and economic boom, benefiting from the alliance with America that their parents had helped build. Many visited America, studied at American universities, and worked for companies doing business with America. They carried their parents' complex legacy of having been enemies who became admirers of American values and advocates for Japanese-American friendship. The educational programs for Japanese prisoners implemented by American authorities during imprisonment proved remarkably effective at changing attitudes. Surveys conducted decades later found that former Japanese prisoners held significantly more favorable views of democracy, America, and peaceful international cooperation than Japanese who had not been imprisoned. This correlation suggested that exposure to American values and practices during imprisonment had lasting impact on political attitudes and world views. The prisoners had experienced a natural experiment in comparative systems, seeing firsthand the practical results of democratic capitalism versus militaristic authoritarianism, and the evidence had convinced many that the American system produced better outcomes for ordinary people. The irony was profound. Imprisonment by the enemy had liberated these men from the mental prison of propaganda and militaristic nationalism. The contrast between American treatment reflecting values of human rights and dignity versus Japanese propaganda depicting Americans as brutal savages had forced prisoners to question everything they had been taught. This questioning had opened minds to considering that perhaps Japan's military government had been wrong about many things, perhaps the war had been a mistake based on lies and miscalculations, and perhaps Japan's future required learning from the enemy rather than nursing grievances over defeat. These were dangerous thoughts in wartime Japan, thoughts that could have led to execution for defeatism. But prisoners in American camps could safely think these thoughts, discuss them with fellow prisoners, and gradually construct new understandings of the war and their nation's place in the world. The American decision to treat Japanese prisoners humanely according to international law, despite the intense anger Americans felt after Pearl Harbor and widespread reports of Japanese atrocities against Allied prisoners, reflected a strategic calculation that went beyond simple morality. American officials understood that how America treated enemies would affect post-war relations and America's global reputation. Treating prisoners brutally might have satisfied desires for revenge but would have undermined America's claims to be fighting for civilized values against barbarism. Treating prisoners humanely, in stark contrast to Axis brutality, demonstrated that American values were not mere propaganda but actual principles guiding policy even toward enemies. This demonstration of values proved more powerful than any propaganda in convincing neutrals and enemies that American victory would bring a better world than Axis victory. The long-term strategic success of this policy became evident in post-war decades. Japan and Germany, former enemies who had experienced occupation by democratic powers that respected human rights even during warfare, became stable democracies and close American allies. In contrast, nations occupied by the Soviet Union, which had treated both civilians and prisoners with extreme brutality, became resentful satellites seeking escape from Soviet control at first opportunity. The correlation between wartime conduct and post-war relations demonstrated that moral behavior had strategic value, a lesson that some democratic powers forgot in later conflicts to their detriment. The Japanese former prisoners who had witnessed American industrial might firsthand became walking refutations of the propaganda that had led Japan to war. They had seen with their own eyes the factories, farms, infrastructure, and abundance that made American victory inevitable. They could testify that Japanese military planners had based their strategies on catastrophically wrong assumptions about American weakness and Japanese superiority. This testimony was invaluable during the post-war period when Japanese society was reconstructing its understanding of the war and its causes. Nationalist narratives that portrayed the war as Japan's noble struggle against Western imperialism had to confront the reality that Japan had been the aggressor and had lost because its economic and industrial base was inadequate to sustain total war against an opponent whose capacity was 10 times greater. Former prisoners could explain these realities from first-hand observation, making the lessons undeniable. The story of Japanese prisoners discovering American industrial might parallels the experiences of German prisoners of war, Italian prisoners, and prisoners from other Axis nations. Across all these groups, imprisonment in America provided education in democratic values and practical demonstrations of economic and industrial capacity that contradicted Axis propaganda. This was not accidental. American officials deliberately designed prison camp policies to expose prisoners to American abundance and democratic principles, believing that these exposures would create advocates for democracy who would return home and influence post-war reconstruction. The policy was remarkably successful, contributing to the democratic transformation of former enemy nations and the creation of peaceful international order that has largely persisted for 8 decades since the war's end. The psychological journey from fanatical militarism to acceptance of democratic values was neither instant nor universal among Japanese prisoners. The process unfolded gradually through accumulated experiences that challenged preconceptions and forced cognitive recalibration. Unlike German prisoners who often retained some framework of Western thought even under Nazi ideology, Japanese prisoners had to bridge a wider cultural and philosophical gap. Their education had taught them that Japan's divine emperor represented absolute authority, that individual life had value only in service to the state, that death was preferable to surrender, and that Western materialism indicated spiritual weakness. Every day in American captivity contradicted these teachings through lived experience rather than verbal argument. The Americans rarely lectured prisoners about democracy or tried to explicitly convert them to American values. Instead, they simply operated according to their principles and allowed prisoners to observe the results. This indirect education proved far more effective than propaganda could have been. When prisoners saw American guards treating them with basic respect despite having comrades killed by Japanese forces, the guards demonstrated that American values were authentic rather than expedient. When prisoners received the same medical care as American soldiers, they experienced practical equality rather than abstract principle. When camp administrators followed written regulations rather than arbitrary whims, prisoners learned that rule of law was real and functional. These daily demonstrations of values in action planted seeds of doubt about Japanese propaganda that gradually grew into fundamental reassessment of beliefs prisoners had considered unquestionable truth. The internal conflict this created was profound and sometimes unbearable. Japanese merchant marine officer Hideo Noda, captured when his ship was sunk in 1944, kept a secret diary throughout his imprisonment that was later published in Japan in the 1980s. His entries trace a painful psychological journey from certainty to confusion to reluctant acceptance of new understanding. Early entries express shame at being captured alive and contempt for American materialism. Middle period entries question why Americans behave honorably despite having no apparent spiritual foundation. Later entries acknowledge that perhaps material abundance and individual rights create better societies than spiritual rhetoric and authoritarian control. The final entries before repatriation express fear of returning to Japan because he no longer believed in the principles that governed Japanese society but could not imagine openly advocating American-style democracy without being viewed as a traitor contaminated by enemy propaganda. Noda's diary reveals the intense pressure Japanese prisoners faced to maintain group solidarity and collective loyalty even when individual experiences contradicted group ideology. Japanese culture's emphasis on harmony and conformity made it socially dangerous to openly question shared beliefs. Prisoners who suggested that America might not be evil, or that Japan might have made mistakes, or that democracy might have advantages, risked ostracism by fellow prisoners who remained committed to militaristic nationalism. This social pressure maintained orthodox views in public while private doubts accumulated in individual minds. The result was a population of prisoners, many of whom were individually reconsidering their beliefs but collectively maintaining the appearance of unchanged loyalty to Japanese imperial ideology. The camps held men of varying ages, ranks, and backgrounds whose different perspectives created tensions that American authorities had to manage carefully. Older career military officers tended to remain rigidly committed to Bushido principles and imperial loyalty. These men had invested their entire adult lives in the military system and had risen to positions of authority within it. Acknowledging that the system was fundamentally flawed would have meant accepting that their life's work had been wasted in service of lies. Most such men could not make this psychological leap and remained loyal to Bushido principles until death, viewing their imprisonment as temporary interruption that would end either with Japanese victory or their own deaths. These hardliners attempted to maintain military discipline within camps, organizing prisoners into hierarchical structures, demanding obedience to senior officers, and sometimes punishing prisoners who cooperated too willingly with Americans or expressed doubts about eventual Japanese victory. Younger enlisted men and junior officers had less investment in the old system and were more open to new ideas. Many had been conscripted recently and had not fully internalized militaristic ideology before capture. These men had experienced the worst of Japanese military culture, brutal discipline, inadequate supplies, suicidal tactics, and commanders who treated soldiers as expendable ammunition. Their imprisonment in America, where even enemy prisoners received adequate food and medical care, contrasted sharply with their experience as Japanese soldiers. These younger prisoners were more likely to conclude that something was wrong with the Japanese system and that American approaches might be superior. However, they had to conceal these thoughts from hardline senior officers who still claimed authority over prisoner populations. The factional tensions occasionally erupted into violence. In several camps, hardline factions attacked prisoners they accused of collaboration or defeatism. American guards had to intervene to protect prisoners from their own comrades. These incidents revealed that even in captivity, Japanese military culture's brutality persisted, with senior officers claiming the right to enforce discipline through violence against subordinates who questioned their authority. American camp administrators responded by segregating the most fanatical prisoners from the general population, creating separate compounds for hardliners who refused to accept that the war was lost and threatened violence against more moderate prisoners. These segregation policies allowed the majority of prisoners to interact with Americans and absorb new perspectives without constant intimidation from fanatical minorities. The hardline compounds themselves became increasingly isolated and disconnected from reality as the war progressed. Prisoners in these compounds maintained elaborate fantasies about imminent Japanese victory, refused to believe accurate news reports, and constructed conspiracy theories explaining why Japan's obvious defeats were actually part of clever strategic plans. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, some hardliners literally could not accept the reality. They accused the American announcements of being propaganda tricks. When Japanese government representatives arrived to confirm the surrender and order prisoners to cooperate with repatriation, some hardliners accused these representatives of being traitors or American agents. A few attempted suicide rather than accept surrender. Others went through the motions of repatriation while maintaining internal belief that true patriots would eventually restore imperial rule and punish those who had collaborated with occupation forces. These men returned to Japan expecting vindication but instead found a nation that had largely accepted defeat and was cooperating with American occupation authorities to rebuild on democratic foundations. The cultural shock of discovering that Japan had moved on without them left many embittered and isolated for the remainder of their lives. Educational programs for prisoners expanded significantly after Japan's surrender when American authorities no longer worried that educated prisoners might escape and return to combat. The programs aimed to prepare prisoners for return to a democratized Japan by teaching English, introducing democratic political concepts, and explaining American economic systems. Participation was voluntary, and initial enrollment was limited to prisoners brave enough to openly indicate interest in American ideas. As more prisoners attended classes without facing punishment from hardline factions, enrollment increased. By early 1946, thousands of Japanese prisoners were attending classes in English, civics, and vocational skills that would help them function in post-war Japan. The English classes revealed interesting cultural dynamics. Japanese education had taught English as a written language through grammar and translation exercises, producing students who could parse Victorian literature but could not conduct basic conversations. American instructors taught conversational English using direct method immersion, engaging students in dialogues about everyday topics. Japanese students initially found this approach frustrating because they wanted systematic grammar rules rather than messy practice conversations. But gradually they discovered they were actually learning to communicate in English rather than just learning about English as an abstract system. This pedagogical shift from theoretical knowledge to practical skill mirrored the broader lesson of their imprisonment. American pragmatism that focused on what worked practically often produced better results than Japanese approaches that emphasized theoretical purity and aesthetic perfection. The civics classes explaining democratic government faced the challenge of describing political concepts that had no equivalents in Japanese experience. The instructor explained that in democracy, government authority came from the consent of the governed rather than from divine mandate or hereditary right. Citizens had the right to criticize government, vote for representatives, and demand accountability. Government officials were public servants rather than rulers. These concepts seemed almost incomprehensible to men raised in a culture where the emperor was divine, criticism of authority was treasonous, and citizens existed to serve the state rather than vice versa. One prisoner asked how government could function if citizens could freely criticize leaders and vote them out of office. Would this not create chaos? The instructor explained that democracy was indeed messy and sometimes inefficient, but it had self-correcting mechanisms that authoritarian systems lacked. If democratic leaders made bad decisions, voters could replace them in the next election. If authoritarian leaders made bad decisions, they could perpetuate those decisions indefinitely since no mechanism existed to remove them or change course. The instructor pointed out that Japan's military government had led the nation into a catastrophic war based on flawed assumptions, but no internal mechanism had existed to question those assumptions or change course until total defeat forced change from outside. A democratic Japan would have mechanisms to prevent such catastrophes by allowing open debate and leadership accountability. This argument was convincing to some prisoners but remained abstract until they returned to Japan and experienced democratic reforms firsthand. The vocational training programs prepared prisoners for civilian occupations in an economy that would be radically different from pre-war Japan. American instructors taught skills including carpentry, automotive repair, electrical work, plumbing, and other trades. The training emphasized practical skills using modern tools and techniques. Japanese prisoners discovered that American vocational education assumed students could learn sophisticated skills through systematic instruction rather than the traditional Japanese apprenticeship model where apprentices spent years doing menial tasks before gradually being trusted with skilled work. American instructors treated students as intelligent adults capable of learning quickly when taught properly, providing clear explanations and hands-on practice with immediate feedback. This respectful pedagogy contrasted with Japanese education that emphasized rote memorization, strict discipline, and a hierarchical distance between teachers and students. Prisoners who completed vocational training programs returned to Japan with marketable skills and teaching credentials that helped them find employment during the difficult post-war period when jobs were scarce. Some became instructors themselves, teaching skills to other Japanese workers and spreading American vocational education methods throughout Japan's recovering industries. This knowledge transfer contributed to Japan's post-war economic development by creating a skilled workforce trained in modern techniques. The economic education of prisoners occurred partly through formal classes but mostly through observation and work experience. Prisoners who worked on American farms learned modern agricultural techniques including mechanization, fertilizers, crop rotation, and scientific breeding. Those who worked in factories learned about assembly line production, quality control, worker training, and industrial organization. Those who worked on construction projects learned about project planning, specialized equipment, and systematic procedures. All of these experiences exposed prisoners to economic practices more efficient than Japanese equivalents. When these men returned to Japan, they brought knowledge that informed economic reconstruction. Japanese agriculture modernized rapidly in post-war decades partly because returning prisoners and occupation advisors introduced American farming methods that dramatically increased productivity. Japanese manufacturing adopted quality control and production management techniques based on American methods, then improved them into the famous Toyota production system and other innovations that eventually set global manufacturing standards. Japanese construction learned to plan systematically and use specialized equipment efficiently. These economic transfers from former enemy to defeated nation through the medium of repatriated prisoners represented one of history's more unusual but successful technology transfer programs. The psychology of captivity created unusual openness to new ideas that might not have existed under other circumstances. Prisoners had been stripped of their previous status and identity. They had failed in their military mission, survived when honor demanded death, and faced an uncertain future. This psychological dislocation created space for reconsidering beliefs that had seemed immutable under normal circumstances. Psychologists who studied former prisoners in later decades found that many described their captivity as a transformative period when they had been freed from social pressures to conform and had been able to think independently for the first time in their lives. The isolation from Japanese society, combined with exposure to radically different American society, created conditions for genuine reconsideration of fundamental assumptions about government, culture, economics, and values. This psychological openness was temporary. Upon returning to Japan, many former prisoners found themselves reabsorbed into Japanese social structures and conformity pressures that limited their ability to maintain independent thinking or advocate openly for ideas they had adopted during captivity. But the mental transformation during imprisonment left permanent marks. Even prisoners who outwardly conformed to Japanese expectations often maintained private convictions that American democracy and capitalism had advantages over Japanese authoritarianism and militarism. These private convictions influenced their choices about careers, how they raised their children, and how they voted in elections. The aggregate effect of thousands of former prisoners holding these views contributed to Japan's post-war trajectory toward stable democracy and market economics. The religious dimensions of prisoners' transformations have received less attention but were significant for many individuals. Traditional Japanese religion combined Shinto emperor worship with Buddhist philosophy and Confucian ethics, creating a spiritual framework that justified hierarchical society and state supremacy over individuals. American society's separation of church and state, religious pluralism, and emphasis on individual conscience seemed chaotic and potentially immoral to Japanese prisoners raised to believe that social harmony required shared religious beliefs enforced by state authority. Yet prisoners observed that American society functioned well despite religious diversity. Christians, Jews, and secular Americans lived together peacefully, following shared civil laws while maintaining different private beliefs. This religious tolerance demonstrated that social order did not require religious uniformity, challenging Japanese assumptions that diversity inevitably meant conflict. Some prisoners converted to Christianity during captivity after encountering American Christian chaplains who offered spiritual counseling. The conversions were genuine in most cases rather than opportunistic attempts to gain favor with captors. Japanese men struggling with guilt over survival, anger at their government for leading them into disaster, and confusion about their future found Christian teachings about forgiveness, redemption, and individual relationship with God psychologically compelling. Christianity's emphasis on individual conscience and personal salvation contrasted with Japanese religion's emphasis on group harmony and duty to ancestors and state. For men whose group identity had been shattered by defeat and capture, Christianity offered a path to reconstruct meaning and purpose based on individual faith rather than collective belonging. These conversions were controversial in Japan. Christian converts faced suspicion and discrimination, accused of having betrayed Japanese identity by adopting enemy religion. But the converts argued that Christianity was not inherently foreign, pointing to Japan's small but long-standing Christian community predating the war. They maintained that Christianity's teachings about love, forgiveness, and peace were exactly what post-war Japan needed to heal and move forward. Some Christian former prisoners became ministers and missionaries, spreading Christian faith and values in post-war Japan. Their influence was modest in absolute terms since Christianity remained a minority religion, but disproportionate because Christian values emphasizing individual dignity and rights aligned with and reinforced democratic reforms being implemented by occupation authorities. The interaction between American guards and Japanese prisoners revealed interesting dynamics of power, race, and culture. American guards were mostly young men from working-class backgrounds with limited education and no knowledge of Japan or Japanese culture. Many harbored intense anger toward Japanese people after Pearl Harbor and reports of Japanese atrocities. Maintaining professional conduct toward prisoners required overcoming these emotions and treating enemies according to military regulations and Geneva Convention rules. Most guards succeeded in maintaining professional standards, though incidents of abuse occurred. Japanese prisoners were surprised that American guards were not uniformly brutal savages as propaganda had depicted. Individual guards varied in their attitudes and behavior. Some were friendly and curious about Japanese culture, attempting to communicate despite language barriers and treating prisoners as fellow human beings. Others maintained cold professional distance, following regulations without warmth but also without cruelty. A few were hostile and cruel, using their authority to harass prisoners, though serious abuse was punished by American authorities when discovered. This variation in individual behavior taught prisoners that Americans were individuals with different personalities rather than a monolithic enemy collective. The concept of individualism itself was foreign and initially incomprehensible to Japanese prisoners whose culture emphasized group identity and conformity. The racial dynamics were complex. Japanese propaganda had portrayed the war as racial struggle between Asian peoples defending themselves against white colonial oppression. Yet in American camps, prisoners observed that many guards were not white. African American soldiers served as guards, often displaying professional competence and fair treatment of prisoners. This challenged Japanese racial propaganda that had assumed all Americans were white and all whites were unified in racist opposition to Asians. Japanese prisoners had to reconcile the cognitive dissonance between propaganda depicting America as white supremacist society with the reality that America fielded racially integrated military units and treated Japanese prisoners according to consistent standards regardless of guard race. Some prisoners concluded that American racial diversity indicated social strength rather than weakness, contradicting propaganda claims that racial diversity inevitably caused national disintegration. Other prisoners noticed African American guards sometimes express solidarity with Japanese prisoners as fellow people of color oppressed by white supremacy, creating awkward situations where enemies bonded over shared experience of racial discrimination. These interactions revealed that American society was more complicated than propaganda had suggested, neither purely virtuous nor purely evil but a work in progress struggling with internal contradictions while still maintaining functional democracy and enormous economic power. The camp sports programs provided unexpected venues for cultural exchange and mutual understanding. American authorities organized baseball leagues, volleyball tournaments, and track competitions among prisoners, believing that physical activity and competition would maintain health and morale while reducing tension. Japanese prisoners were familiar with baseball, which had been popular in Japan since the early 20th century, though Japanese baseball culture emphasized different values than American baseball. American baseball celebrated individual achievement within team context, with statistics tracking individual player performance. Japanese baseball emphasized team harmony and collective effort, discouraging individual showboating. These different approaches to the same sport reflected broader cultural differences about individualism versus collectivism. American guards sometimes played baseball games against prisoner teams, creating strange scenarios where yesterday's enemies competed in friendly athletic contests. These games were intensely competitive but also oddly humanizing. Shared love of sport created common ground transcending national enmity. A guard who pitched against a prisoner batter or a prisoner who made a spectacular catch earned respect from the opposing side regardless of nationality. After games, players sometimes shared cigarettes and attempted conversations in broken English and Japanese, finding common humanity in athletic competition. These informal contacts did more to break down stereotypes than any formal education program could accomplish. Guards discovered that Japanese prisoners were not subhuman monsters but ordinary men who enjoyed sports, told jokes, and missed their families. Prisoners discovered that American guards were not devils but young men not so different from themselves who wanted to survive the war and go home. These discoveries made it harder to maintain hatred and easier to imagine post-war reconciliation. The artistic and cultural activities organized by prisoners revealed Japanese aesthetic sensibilities that impressed American observers. Prisoners with artistic training created paintings, sculptures, and crafts using whatever materials they could obtain. Some camps hosted exhibitions of prisoner artwork that attracted local American visitors curious about Japanese culture. The artwork ranged from traditional Japanese subjects including landscapes and calligraphy to scenes of camp life documenting the imprisonment experience. American visitors were often surprised by the sophistication and beauty of the artwork, challenging their assumptions that Japanese were culturally backward. These cultural exchanges worked both ways. American authorities occasionally arranged for local musicians, theatrical groups, or speakers to visit camps and perform or lecture for prisoners. Japanese prisoners experienced American music, drama, and culture, often for the first time. Jazz music particularly fascinated some prisoners who had never heard this distinctively American art form. The improvisational nature of jazz, with individual musicians taking solos within group performance, embodied American values of individual expression within collective endeavor. Some prisoners became jazz enthusiasts who brought their appreciation back to Japan, contributing to post-war Japanese jazz culture that would eventually produce world-class musicians. The camp newspapers published in Japanese under American supervision provided another education medium. The newspapers included news about the war, articles about American history and civics, practical information about camp operations, and submissions from prisoners including poetry, essays, and artwork. American authorities carefully edited the newspapers to exclude content that might encourage continued resistance or undermine camp security, but within those constraints allowed considerable prisoner autonomy. The newspapers became forums for prisoners to express themselves and debate ideas. Some prisoners wrote essays arguing that Japan should adopt democratic reforms after the war. Others responded defending Japanese traditions and questioning whether Western democracy was appropriate for Japan. These published debates allowed prisoners to test ideas and engage in political discourse that would have been impossible in wartime Japan where all dissent was suppressed. The experience of participating in semi-free press taught prisoners that open debate did not destroy social order but actually strengthened it by allowing peaceful resolution of disagreements through persuasion rather than force. The medical care provided to Japanese prisoners deserves particular attention because it contradicted their expectations so dramatically and demonstrated American values so clearly. Japanese military medicine was primitive by American standards, with limited supplies, poorly trained medical personnel, and a culture that viewed enduring pain without complaint as virtuous. Japanese soldiers expected minimal medical care and often received none. Wounded soldiers who could not keep up with their units were sometimes abandoned or even killed to prevent capture. This brutal pragmatism reflected Japan's limited medical resources and militaristic culture that valued the mission over individual lives. American military medicine represented the opposite philosophy. Every wounded soldier deserved maximum effort to save his life and restore his health. Medical care was a right, not a privilege. The American military invested heavily in medical personnel, supplies, and facilities. Battlefield medicine included rapid evacuation to field hospitals, surgery by trained surgeons, antibiotics to prevent infection, and rehabilitation to restore function. This comprehensive medical system reflected both American medical sophistication and cultural values that treated individual lives as precious rather than expendable. Japanese prisoners received the same medical care as American soldiers. When prisoners arrived at camps, medical personnel examined them, treated injuries and illnesses, provided vaccinations, and addressed chronic conditions. Prisoners suffering from malnutrition, tropical diseases, or untreated wounds received weeks or months of medical care until they recovered. American doctors and nurses treated enemy prisoners professionally, apparently viewing their duty as healing sick and injured humans regardless of nationality. This non-discriminatory medical care shocked Japanese prisoners who expected at best minimal care and at worst deliberate medical abuse. Several prisoners later described medical care as the experience that most changed their view of America. Japanese Army Private Tokishi Yamamoto arrived at a California camp in 1943 suffering from malaria, malnutrition, and infected wounds. He expected to be left to die, believing Americans would not waste resources on an enemy prisoner. Instead, he spent 2 months in the camp hospital receiving treatment including antimalarial drugs, antibiotics for his infected wounds, nutritious food to address malnutrition, and physical therapy to restore his strength. The doctors and nurses treated him with the same care they gave American patients. When Yamamoto recovered and was released to the general prisoner population, he was physically healthier than he had been before the war. This experience convinced him that American medical care reflected values of human dignity that transcended national boundaries. He returned to Japan after the war, studied medicine, and became a doctor who spent his career providing care to patients regardless of their ability to pay, consciously modeling his practice on the American doctors who had healed him despite being his enemies. Dental care provided another revelation. Japanese soldiers rarely received dental care, resulting in widespread tooth decay and loss. American camps included dental clinics where prisoners could receive examinations, fillings, extractions, and even dentures if needed. Japanese prisoners discovered that Americans considered dental health important enough to provide care even to enemy prisoners. This attention to quality of life issues beyond immediate survival indicated a prosperous society that could afford to care about comfort and long-term health rather than just maintaining people at subsistence level. The psychological counseling available to prisoners represented another unfamiliar concept. American camp authorities recognized that prisoners suffered from stress, depression, and trauma. Psychologists and psychiatrists were available to counsel prisoners struggling with psychological difficulties. This mental health care was completely foreign to Japanese culture, which had no concept of psychological therapy and viewed mental health problems as character weaknesses to be overcome through willpower rather than medical conditions requiring treatment. Some prisoners initially refused counseling, embarrassed to admit psychological struggles. Others found it helpful to discuss their fears, guilt, and confusion with professionals who listened without judgment and offered coping strategies. The availability of mental health care demonstrated that American military recognized psychological wounds as real and important as physical injuries, another manifestation of values that treated human well-being as worthy of investment rather than viewing soldiers as merely equipment to be used until broken. The process of repatriation itself provided final lessons about American organizational capacity and attention to detail. Repatriating over 5,000 prisoners from camps across the United States to war-devastated Japan was a massive logistical challenge. American authorities executed it systematically, creating manifests listing every prisoner with verified identity, organizing prisoners into transport groups, arranging rail transportation to ports, coordinating shipping schedules, and managing the bureaucratic requirements for transferring prisoners to Japanese custody. Each prisoner received documentation verifying his identity and prisoner of war status to protect him from potential discrimination in Japan. Personal possessions were returned. Prisoners who had earned scrip through work programs could exchange it for cash or goods to take home. Medical records were prepared for each prisoner documenting health conditions and treatments received, providing information that would help Japanese doctors continue care if needed. This meticulous organization impressed prisoners who understood from their own military experience how difficult it was to move large numbers of people efficiently. The ships carrying prisoners back to Japan varied in quality, but most were adequate or better. American transport ships had been designed to carry troops in reasonable comfort with proper sanitation, adequate food, and safety equipment. The contrast with Japanese transport ships, which had been minimally modified cargo vessels with primitive accommodations and often inadequate supplies, demonstrated different approaches to logistical planning. American military planners considered troop welfare important enough to justify investment in proper transport vessels. Japanese planners viewed transport ships as mere conveyances where temporary discomfort was acceptable. These different philosophies reflected broader patterns where American military organizations invested in supporting systems while Japanese organizations focused narrowly on combat functions while neglecting support. The superior American approach to logistics was one reason American forces could fight effectively across vast distances while Japanese forces struggled with inadequate supplies despite operating closer to their bases. The legacy of Japanese prisoners' experiences in America extended beyond their immediate post-war contributions into the foundations of modern Japanese society. The approximately 5,000 men who spent months or years in American captivity represented a tiny fraction of Japan's population, yet their influence was disproportionate to their numbers. They had witnessed American industrial capacity firsthand, experienced democratic values in practice, and begun the psychological transformation from militaristic nationalism to acceptance of peace and democracy. Upon return to devastated Japan, these men became interpreters of American intentions during the occupation, advocates for democratic reforms, and living evidence that former enemies could become partners in building a better future. Their collective testimony that America's victory had been inevitable due to overwhelming industrial superiority helped undermine militaristic myths about spiritual strength overcoming material disadvantages. Their acknowledgement that American democracy functioned effectively despite its messiness challenged conservative resistance to political reforms. Their advocacy for learning from America rather than resenting defeat provided intellectual justification for the pragmatic cooperation with occupation authorities that characterized Japan's post-war path. The transformation of Japan from militaristic empire to peaceful democracy within a generation stands as one of the 20th century's most remarkable political achievements. This transformation had many causes including the shock of total defeat, the wisdom of occupation policies, the resilience of Japanese people, and the Cold War context that made America invest heavily in Japanese recovery. But among these multiple factors, the experiences of Japanese prisoners of war in America played a modest but meaningful role. These men had been given an education in American values and industrial capacity that prepared them to serve as bridges between two formerly enemy nations. Their willingness to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about Japanese weakness and American strength, to accept that defeat had resulted from Japan's own miscalculations rather than external injustice, and to advocate for fundamental reforms rather than restoration of pre-war systems, demonstrated intellectual courage that contributed to Japan's successful transition. The story of Japanese prisoners discovering American industrial might thus become more than historical curiosity about wartime prisoner experiences. It reveals how direct exposure to alternative systems can challenge propaganda and ideology, how humane treatment of enemies can create possibilities for post-war reconciliation, how individual transformations can aggregate into social change, and how defeat in war can become opportunity for national renewal when both victors and vanquished choose wisdom over vengeance. The prisoners who boarded ships in American ports for the journey home to devastated Japan in 1946 were returning as different men than they had been when captured. They had seen evidence that contradicted everything their education had taught them about American weakness and Japanese superiority. They had experienced treatment that demonstrated values they had been told Americans lacked. They had been freed from mental constraints of propaganda and given opportunity to think independently about fundamental questions of government, society, and human dignity. These men would spend the remainder of their lives working to rebuild their nation, and their efforts would be informed by lessons learned during the strangest education any of them had ever received: imprisonment by an enemy who demonstrated through actions rather than words what democratic values actually meant in practice. Their legacy persists in the democratic, prosperous, and peaceful Japan they helped build, a nation that chose to learn from former enemies rather than nurse eternal grievances, that adopted beneficial practices regardless of their origin, and that transformed defeat into opportunity for creating a better society. The final lesson of the Japanese prisoner experience may be that no nation has a monopoly on wisdom, that even enemies can learn from each other, and that the future belongs to those willing to acknowledge truth and adapt to reality rather than clinging to comforting myths. The prisoners who had the courage to question their beliefs, accept uncomfortable truths, and advocate for necessary changes demonstrated that patriotism sometimes requires criticizing one's nation in order to improve it. Their story reminds us that transformation is possible, that former enemies can become allies, and that the most powerful weapon in defeating bad ideas is not military force but the undeniable evidence of better alternatives demonstrated through lived experience. In the end, America's greatest victory in the Pacific War was not won at Midway or Iwo Jima, but in the prison camps where Japanese soldiers discovered that the enemy they had been taught to hate actually represented values and achievements worth learning from and emulating.